The moment the first spark touched the dark, the world changed forever. From that single flame began a story of power and loss, of creatures who dared to challenge the wild and became its architects. Humanity rose not from strength, but from defiance, learning to command fire, to carve stone, to dream beyond the stars, and in doing so, sealed both its triumph and its tragedy. This is the story of how we conquered the earth, and what it cost us to do so. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who still believes the past can speak, and subscribe so these forgotten stories keep finding you. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Let's see how far the memory of the first human still travels. Now, close your eyes, breathe with the embers, and return with me to the rise and fall of the first human. The world was colder, wilder, and ruled by silence. The wind moved across the grasslands like an ancient whisper, carrying the scent of rain and dust. Herds of antelope drifted like clouds across the plains, shadowed by lions that waited in the tall grass. Above them, the sky stretched endless and pale, a ceiling of light beneath which the first humans learned what it meant to survive. They did not know they were the beginning of something extraordinary. To them, the world was simply alive, vast, and unending. In the heart of Africa, where rivers braided through acacia trees and volcanic ridges rose like scars from the earth, small bands of early Homo sapiens gathered around flickering fires. They were few, fragile against the immensity of nature, yet something in their eyes already mirrored the intelligence that would one day build cities and reach the stars. Their hands shaped tools of stone, sharper than instinct, their minds learning to think beyond the present. They began to see patterns, the way animals moved before the rain, the way stars returned to the same place each season, the way fire obeyed those who understood it. The night was their teacher. Around the flames, faces glowed with reflection, shadows danced across the ground, and somewhere in those moments of light and fear, imagination was born. Fire changed more than their diet, it changed their perception of time. The darkness no longer ruled unchallenged. They could stay awake, speak, plan, dream. Their world was unforgiving. Every dawn brought a test of endurance. Droughts withered the land, predators hunted without mercy, and the fragile line between life and death was measured in footsteps and chance. Yet, somehow, they endured. Their strength was not in muscle or fang, but in memory. They remembered where the water hid, where the trees bore fruit, where safety could be found. Memory became survival, and survival became the seed of civilization. Far away, other human species walked the earth stronger, thicker boned, adapted to the cold. But here, beneath the equatorial sun, a new kind of being was rising, one that carried curiosity as its greatest weapon. In their bones lay the promise of stories yet untold. In their gaze the spark of a mind that could wonder. As the stars wheeled overhead, the first humans lifted their eyes and saw not just light, but meaning. For the first time, the universe looked back through them. This was the dawn before memory, the quiet breath before history began, when humanity was still learning to dream. Fire became their first companion, stone their first teacher. Across the ancient world, beneath the same stars that burn above us tonight, the first humans began to command forces far greater than themselves. They learned that a spark could mean survival, that stone could be transformed into a weapon sharper than instinct. With every flame that rose from dry grass and every shard chipped from flint, something deeper stirred within them, a quiet revolution of thought. The landscape around them was still untamed, a place where survival demanded ingenuity. Lightning strikes had once terrified them, but now they learned to capture that fire, to feed it, to keep it alive. The dance of flame on wood became a heartbeat in the darkness, a rhythm older than language. Fire offered more than warmth. It pushed back the predators that once ruled the night, preserved food, hardened tools, and opened the gateway to cooked meat that changed the human body itself. Muscles grew stronger. Brains grew larger. The simple act of tending fire shaped the very architecture of who we became. At the same time, stone became their teacher. For millions of years, the earth had been carved by wind and water. But now, it was shaped by thought. From obsidian, quartzite, and flint, they learned precision. A single strike at the right angle could release a blade from the rock, as if thought itself had taken form. These stones were not just tools, they were ideas made solid. Each flake was a testament to planning, patience, and imagination. Around scattered fires, small groups of early humans experimented, shared discoveries, and passed them on. Knowledge began to outlive the individual. What one person learned could be taught, remembered, improved. This was the birth of culture, the moment ideas began to travel through time. The first whispers of humanity's greatest inheritance. Learning. The nights grew shorter, the shadows safer. Those who had once feared the dark now carried its light. Fire and stone had transformed existence from endurance into mastery. With every meal cooked, every shelter strengthened, every predator repelled, they stepped further away from the animal world and closer to something new. In that faint glow of the ancient hearth, our ancestors became creators. They were no longer shaped only by nature. They had begun to shape nature itself. Each spark in the darkness was a promise, a signal that the long journey towards civilization had begun, one flicker of flame and one stone tool at a time. They were wanderers long before they were conquerors. Born beneath the African sun, Homo sapiens began to move quietly at first, then endlessly, as if the horizon itself was calling. From the Rift Valley they followed the curve of rivers and the shimmer of coastlines. Guided by instinct, curiosity, and hunger, each step carried them farther from the lands of their birth, deeper into a world both perilous and full of promise. No map guided them, no language recorded their passage, yet their footprints stitched together the continents. Through savanna and forest, across deserts where heat shimmered like water, small groups began their long migration out of Africa. They walked not as armies, but as families, bands of survivors carrying tools, fire, and the memory of those who came before. To follow the herds was to follow life itself. The coast became their highway. Shellfish and fish sustained them where the land failed. The sea's rhythm became their calendar, its tides their teacher. In the dim light of prehistory, they reached the Arabian Peninsula, moving through green corridors that would later turn to desert. From there, they fanned out toward Asia, tracing river valleys and mountain passes, always moving, always adapting. The world they entered was still raw and wild. Glaciers loomed to the north, jungles breathed in the east, and in the cold winds of Eurasia, other humans waited. The Neanderthals ruled the colder lands, hunters, toolmakers, and thinkers in their own right. When modern humans arrived, they brought something unseen but powerful: adaptability. Their tools were lighter, their shelters more flexible, their minds wired for cooperation and storytelling. In the vast landscapes of the Ice Age, these abilities became their greatest strength. With every generation, they learned to read the world like a language. They could sense storms before they came, track animals across miles of snow, and find water in the driest sands. Their survival depended on memory and imagination, and those who could imagine best endured. They painted their knowledge not on walls yet, but in the minds of their children, passing on an invisible library of wisdom. Across tens of thousands of years, they reached places no other humans had ever seen. Their journey carried them to the foothills of India, the mountains of Central Asia, the frozen plains of Siberia. Some followed the moonlit coasts of the Pacific, eventually crossing into Australia. Others crossed the land bridge into the Americas. The world that had once seemed endless was becoming theirs. They did not know they were changing history. They only knew that to stop moving was to die. And so they walked out of Africa, across the earth, until their footprints covered every corner of the known world. The great wanderers had begun the human story, a story written not in ink, but in footsteps, fading beneath ancient skies. The winds that swept across Ice Age Europe carried a bitter chill, a cold that could carve through bone. It was a world ruled by mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, where glaciers loomed like frozen mountains and valleys echoed with the cries of wolves. In this harsh, glittering wilderness lived another kind of human, the Neanderthals. They were not our ancestors, but our kin, shaped by a different rhythm of survival, honed by hundreds of thousands of winters. Their bodies told the story of their world. Broad-shouldered and powerful, they were built for endurance, for holding heat against the relentless cold. Their hands were strong enough to split stone, yet precise enough to craft the delicate edges of flint blades. Beneath heavy brows, their eyes held the same spark that burned in ours: awareness, curiosity, the light of understanding. They were no beasts of burden. They were masters of the north. The Neanderthals knew the art of fire. They built hearths deep inside caves where smoke curled against stone walls, where warmth turned night into sanctuary. Around those flames, they repaired tools, prepared hides, and raised children who would grow to inherit a frozen kingdom. They hunted in coordinated groups, bringing down massive prey with strategy and strength. Every hunt was a test of unity, every fire a celebration of survival. They also dreamed. In caves from Spain to Croatia, ochre and charcoal traced their imagination: the outline of hands, the careful placement of pigments on stalagmites, and perhaps even symbolic carvings long before Homo sapiens arrived. They buried their dead, placed flowers and antlers near the bodies, gestures that speak of reverence and grief. In their silence, there was language. In their eyes, memory. For thousands of years, they thrived in a land where few others could endure. Their minds adapted to the cold as surely as their bodies. They read the seasons in the stars, the wind, and the soil. They shaped bone and ivory into tools, and in doing so, shaped the first glimmers of culture north of the Great Plains. Yet the world was changing. Far to the south, another kind of human was moving lighter in build, more mobile, carrying new ways of thinking. The earth now held two heirs to the same ancestral spark, one born of endurance, the other of innovation. The Neanderthals had mastered the cold, but soon they would face something even more unpredictable than the ice. As the snow fell softly over their hearths, they could not have known that the world was already shifting beneath their feet, and that the meeting of these two kinds of humans would mark one of the most profound turning points in the story of our species. The meeting was inevitable. Somewhere between the deserts of the Levant and the green valleys that bordered the Mediterranean, two kinds of humans crossed paths. The air was heavy with the scent of wild thyme and smoke from distant fires. Herds moved across the horizon, following the same migratory paths that both species depended upon. It was here, in this crossroads between continents, that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals looked upon one another for the first time. Not as myths or enemies, but as living mirrors of what it meant to be human. They were separated by little more than a few 100,000 years of evolution, yet those small differences shaped everything. The Neanderthals carried the strength of endurance. Their bodies adapted to cold and hardship. Homo sapiens carried the spark of abstraction, a mind attuned to pattern, rhythm, and imagination. They spoke with gestures, with eyes, with sounds that may have blended meaning and emotion in ways both understood. The meeting of these two worlds was not a clash, it was a conversation written in the oldest language of all, survival. The landscape itself bore witness to their encounter. Stone tools from both species have been found in the same layers of soil, their flakes mingling like the signatures of shared history. Fireplaces, tools, and shelters speak of parallel lives lived in the same land. sometimes competing, sometimes coexisting. The exchange may have begun with curiosity, a trade of resources, a shared hunt, perhaps a cautious approach by firelight. What began as proximity may have grown into something far more intimate. Genetic evidence tells us that they did not simply coexist, they intertwined. Modern humans carry fragments of Neanderthal DNA within every cell, proof of ancient unions between the two species. These encounters were not fleeting. They left an imprint that endures in our skin, our immune systems, even our thoughts. The boundary between us and them was never as clear as we once believed. For tens of thousands of years, their worlds overlapped in this fragile balance. The Neanderthals watched the newcomers with eyes both familiar and strange. The Homo sapiens, in turn, observed a people so human that their presence may have stirred recognition, like seeing one's reflection in a different time. Two branches of the same family, meeting before one faded forever. The Levant was their threshold, the bridge between species and destinies. From those first encounters came both legacy and loss. The Neanderthals would slowly retreat northward into the colder shadows of Europe, while Homo sapiens continued their restless expansion. Yet for a moment, in that brief chapter of deep time, the Earth held two versions of humanity, walking side by side beneath the same stars, each carrying the same fragile flame of awareness that would define us all. For a brief moment in the vast span of prehistory, there was peace. The great struggle for survival paused, and two kinds of humans shared the same world not as rivals, but as kin. Around campfires that flickered in the twilight of the Ice Age, Neanderthal and Homo sapiens may have sat together, their shadows mingling on the cave walls. The evidence left behind suggests cooperation, not conquest. It tells of trade, of learning, and of an exchange far deeper than any tool or gesture. Across the fertile valleys of the Levant and the plains of southern Europe, the traces of both species lie side by side. The tools of Neanderthals, heavy, precise, shaped by generations of mastery, appear next to the lighter, more experimental blades of modern humans. In these shared sites, fire was not a possession but a bridge. One flame lit by a Neanderthal might have kindled a hearth for Homo sapiens miles away. The light of survival passed between them like a whisper across time. Archaeologists uncover fragments of ochre, beads carved from bone, and pigments ground into dust. Such things serve no purpose in hunting or toolmaking. They serve memory, beauty, and belief. They suggest that ideas were shared, that creativity itself became a language. In those exchanges, something remarkable occurred. Two worlds that had evolved apart began to shape each other. Children were born who carried both bloodlines. Their bones rest in the soil of Eurasia, silent witnesses to a union that forever changed the human story. The genetic legacy of those children survives in us today, in our skin, in our resistance to disease, in small traces of ancient resilience coded into our DNA. They remind us that humanity was never singular. We are a tapestry woven from many threads. It is easy to imagine tension, competition, and fear. But what also lived between them was curiosity. The Neanderthals, masters of the cold, taught endurance and skill. The Homo sapiens, driven by adaptability, brought new tools, new ideas, new ways of seeing. Together they weathered the turning of the Ice Age, huddled in shelters against winds that howled across continents. In this fragile coexistence, something profound unfolded: the birth of shared humanity. Two species looked at one another and saw reflection, not difference. And as the fires burned against the darkness, the world took its first step toward unity. It was here, in this brief and shining chapter, that the meaning of being human began to transcend the boundaries of blood. For a time, the earth was home to more than one kind of us, and for that brief age of peace, the fire truly belonged to everyone. Somewhere in the darkness of a cave, beneath a flickering flame, the human mind awoke. The world was still ruled by ice and silence, but inside those shadowed chambers, something entirely new was being born: the ability to imagine. The first lines scratched into stone were not random, they were intention made visible. Spirals, dots, handprints, and animal forms glowed softly under the trembling light of torches. For the first time, thought had escaped the prison of the mind and taken shape in the world. These symbols were more than decoration. They were a conversation with the unseen, an attempt to capture meaning itself. When the first humans painted the curve of a mammoth's tusk or the leap of a horse across a cave wall, they were not simply recording what they saw. They were revealing how they thought. In those images we find the earliest evidence of abstraction, the ability to transform memory and emotion into symbol. It was not only survival that defined our species now, but expression. Every pigment told a story. Red ochre for blood and life, black charcoal for night and mystery, white clay for spirit and bone. They mixed these elements with fat, saliva, and ash, creating the palette of the human soul. Their hands left prints across the rock, as if claiming a place in time itself. Those stenciled hands, some small as a child's, whisper across 30,000 years. They say, "I was here, I saw, I imagined." The awakening of imagination led to the birth of language. Before words were spoken, meaning moved through rhythm, gesture, and sound. Around fires, humans began to weave shared understanding out of noise and silence. A hum became a word became a story, and a story became history. Communication bound them together, allowing knowledge to grow beyond any single lifetime. In this awakening, art and language became inseparable from survival. They carried warnings of danger, memories of migration, instructions for living, and dreams for the unseen world. Every mark on the cave wall, every symbol drawn in ash or carved in bone, was an act of hope, a belief that something created could outlast the creator. The mind had crossed a threshold. No longer bound to the moment, humans could now live in the past and imagine the future. The world outside the cave was still brutal, but inside, light touched thought for the first time. The human spirit had learned to see beyond what was real, and in that single act of imagination, consciousness became civilization's first spark. Long before history began, humans learned to speak through color and shape. Deep within the caverns of Chauvet, El Castillo, and Blombos, the walls became their first canvas, and the earth itself their witness. The flicker of a torch revealed something miraculous: images of mammoths, lions, bison, and stars, painted with precision, grace, and emotion. These were not crude marks of instinct, but the careful expressions of minds awake to beauty. Every stroke was a heartbeat, every line a thought made eternal. The artists who entered these caves were explorers of the soul. They mixed red ochre with animal fat, black charcoal with powdered stone, creating pigments that have survived for tens of thousands of years. They used their hands as stencils, pressing them against the rock and blowing pigment through hollow bones, leaving behind red silhouettes like spirits reaching through time. Some images were drawn high upon ceilings, suggesting scaffolds or deliberate planning. Others were layered upon older drawings, a silent conversation between generations. By the light of their flames, they painted movement. Horses galloped in overlapping strokes, lions hunted in coordinated packs, mammoths stood massive and still beneath ghostly constellations of dots. This was more than decoration. It was observation turned into vision. These early artists captured not just what they saw, but what they felt: the rhythm of the hunt, the awe of the unknown, the fragile balance between life and death. In the caves of Blombos, in South Africa, even earlier, Mark's cross-hatched lines, carved into ochre over 70,000 years ago, reveal the roots of abstract thought. These were humans thinking in symbols, not merely reacting to their world, but shaping it. The same impulse that drew animals on walls would one day draw constellations in the sky, maps on parchment, and equations on chalkboards. The journey of art was the journey of thought itself. These paintings were sacred acts. Many were placed in the deepest chambers, where sunlight never reached. The artists ventured far into the dark, guided only by firelight and imagination. Perhaps they believed these places were thresholds between worlds, the living and the spirit, the known and the eternal. When the flames danced, the painted animals seemed to move, as if life itself stirred within stone. What began as pigment and breath became a form of memory. Through art, early humans conquered time. They could now pass knowledge, emotion, and belief to those they would never meet. The first artists gave humanity its oldest mirror, a reflection of wonder and awareness that still endures today. Beneath layers of earth and centuries of silence, their voices remain. The walls still speak, and they remind us that the need to create is as ancient as the need to survive. The world had grown colder. Vast sheets of ice gripped the northern continents, grinding mountains into dust and swallowing valleys beneath endless white. The air itself seemed to shimmer with silence, broken only by the distant crack of glaciers and the low thunder of herds moving across the frozen plains. This was the age of endurance, when the human spirit was tested against the full strength of nature. In this world of wind and frost, survival was not a habit, it was an art. Across the tundra of Ice Age Eurasia, small bands of humans followed the great herds that sustained them. Mammoths, reindeer, and bison were not just prey, they were lifelines. Each hunt demanded precision, courage, and deep understanding of the land. The hunters watched the movements of the herds as carefully as the stars, learning their patterns, their migrations, and their moods. In this frozen world, instinct alone was not enough. Intelligence had become the sharpest weapon. The cold was merciless. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, and storms swept across the plains without warning. Yet, against these odds, the hunters thrived. They learned to turn the bones of the mammoth into shelter, raising curved ribs and tusks into arched frames, covering them with hides stitched together by sinew. Inside these bone houses, fires flickered softly, their glow reflected on the pale ivory walls. The breath of the people mingled with the smoke, filling the shelter with warmth and life in a world made of ice. Their clothing was crafted with care, layered furs and hides sewn tightly to trap every ounce of heat. Needles made from bone pierced through reindeer leather with the precision of modern tools. They carried stone-tipped spears, atlatls for throwing them farther, and blades fine enough to cut sinew or carve art. In their hands, technology was not an invention, it was adaptation. Each tool, each stitch, each fire, lit against the wind, was an act of genius born from necessity. But even in hardship, beauty persisted. Carvings of animals were etched into ivory and bone, perhaps as offerings, perhaps as memory. Small figurines, some shaped like humans, others like spirits of the hunt, spoke of belief, of imagination, kindled even in desolation. These objects reveal something timeless, that even when every breath was a struggle, humans still sought meaning beyond survival. The hunters lived by rhythm, the rhythm of migration, of seasons, of the moon guiding their steps across the snow. They traveled light, moving where the herds led them, crossing frozen rivers and open plains that stretched farther than sight. At night, they huddled near the fires, the aurora flickering above like spirits dancing in the sky. Beneath those shifting lights, the world must have felt both infinite and intimate, a vast wilderness holding the fragile glow of human warmth. In this frozen age, humanity proved its resilience. The same species that once gathered fruit in the warmth of Africa now ruled the tundra. They had mastered fire, fashioned weapons, and built shelter from the bones of giants. Every breath of steam in the cold air was a declaration. Humanity would endure. The Ice Age forged not only the body, but the mind. It shaped memory, discipline, cooperation, and creativity. The hunters of ice and wind were not just survivors of their time, they were architects of ours. From their frozen camps came the knowledge that would one day seed villages, cities, and civilization itself. The cold had tested them, and in enduring it, they learned what it truly meant to be human. The Ice Age did not only reshape the land, it reshaped humanity itself. Across the frozen plains of Eurasia, the two surviving branches of humankind, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, found themselves bound by the same struggle against the cold. The world was vast, but the warmth of survival was rare, and in that scarcity, the old boundaries began to blur. Their meeting was not one of conquest, but of necessity, of recognition between two kinds of beings who shared the same fire, the same fear, and the same fragile hope. The landscape they inhabited was both beautiful and brutal. Winds tore across the tundra, and snow fell in relentless silence, covering the bones of the past. Food was scarce, and winters could last for years. In these conditions, alliances were worth more than pride. The Neanderthals, with their deep knowledge of the northern terrain, their endurance, and their skill in crafting tools for the hunt, were unmatched in the cold. The newcomers from Africa brought something different: flexibility, wider networks of cooperation, and an imagination that reached beyond survival. Together, they formed a partnership that defied extinction. Evidence of this connection lies within us. Every living human outside Africa carries fragments of Neanderthal DNA, a quiet inheritance written in blood. These genetic traces are not relics of domination, but of union. They tell of shared fires, shared shelters, and shared lives. The mingling of these two species did not happen once but many times, scattered across thousands of years and thousands of miles, from the caves of the Caucasus to the river valleys of France and Siberia. The children of these unions were living bridges between worlds, carrying within their cells the combined legacy of two human stories. This blending changed us. Neanderthal genes strengthened our immune systems, helping us resist diseases that thrived in the colder climate. They influenced the shape of our skulls, the color of our skin and hair, even the rhythms of our sleep. The Neanderthals never vanished entirely. They live on in the smallest corners of who we are. When we look in the mirror, part of that reflection comes from them. The bond was not only biological, but emotional. In the frozen world of the Upper Paleolithic, companionship was not a luxury. It was survival itself. Firelight became the meeting ground where difference dissolved. Families formed around shared warmth, shared hunts, and shared songs carried through the icy air. There, in the dim glow of the hearth, two species that had once walked separate paths began to merge into one enduring lineage. As time passed, the ice thickened and the seasons grew harsher. The Neanderthal populations, already small and scattered, began to dwindle. But their legacy did not fade. It passed through the generations, silent but enduring, woven into the genetic tapestry of the humans who would inherit the earth. The cold may have buried their bones, but it could not bury their essence. The snow that once covered their tracks became the foundation of our story. Every heartbeat, every breath of warmth against the frozen wind carries echoes of that ancient bond. The bloodlines that met beneath the ice shaped the future of humankind, not through conquest or division, but through connection, adaptation, and the quiet power of survival shared between two worlds that, for a time, became one. The end came quietly. There were no great battles, no single night of extinction, only a slow fading of a people who had endured the ice for hundreds of thousands of years. The Neanderthals, the cold giants of the north, who had mastered fire, carved stone, and painted with the earth's own colors, began to vanish from the record of life. One by one, their hearths went dark. The wind that once carried their voices now swept across empty valleys and frozen plains, whispering the memory of a vanished kind. The climate turned against them first. The ice advanced and retreated in erratic waves, reshaping entire ecosystems faster than they could adapt. Forests they once hunted in gave way to treeless tundra. Herds of large animals, their primary source of food, began to migrate or disappear. The land that had sustained them for generations became unpredictable, forcing them into smaller and more isolated pockets of survival. In these shrinking refuges, scarcity replaced abundance. Starvation followed. At the same time, the world grew more crowded. Modern humans, once strangers to their northern territories, were spreading rapidly across Europe and Western Asia. They carried with them tools of new design, lighter and more efficient, and a web of social bonds that stretched across vast distances. They adapted to change with remarkable speed. Where Neanderthals relied on strength and endurance, Homo sapiens relied on numbers and networks. The difference was subtle, but decisive. Yet the disappearance of the Neanderthals was not a story of conquest. It was a story of quiet erosion, of a population too small to recover from the blows of time and chance. Genetic studies suggest their numbers may have fallen below a few thousand across an entire continent. Disease, malnutrition, and isolation deepened the loss. Inbreeding weakened their resilience, and when their last communities retreated into the caves of southern Iberia, they carried the weight of an ending already written by climate, scarcity, and the relentless advance of their cousins. Still, they did not vanish completely. Their presence lingers in the genome of nearly every person alive today. Their blood still moves within ours. Their strength still shapes our bones. Their resilience still echoes in our immune systems. We carry them with us. A reminder that extinction does not always mean erasure. Part of what it means to be human is to remember what came before. When the last Neanderthal fire burned low, there were no witnesses to mourn them. The mammoths still wandered the plains, the snow still fell, and the stars still turned overhead, indifferent to the passing of one kind of human. But the silence they left behind was not empty, it was the silence of transition. In that stillness, Homo sapiens inherited the earth alone. The world had grown quieter, but also more complex. For the first time, there was only one human species walking the earth. The others had gone, leaving behind tools, bones, and echoes of laughter that would one day be unearthed by their descendants. The Neanderthals did not truly die out. They transformed. Their memory became part of us. Their story folded into our own. The vanishing of their kind was not an end, but emerging the last chapter of an ancient lineage whose fire still burns. Faint, but unforgotten, within the blood of every living human being. When the last Neanderthal vanished from the frozen caves of Iberia, the world did not end, it transformed. Their bodies disappeared, but their essence endured, woven silently into the genetic fabric of those who came after. In every living human today lies a faint echo of that ancient lineage, a whisper of their strength, their adaptability, their will to survive. Humanity had not erased its cousins. It had absorbed its own reflection. The Ice Age continued to sculpt the earth, carving rivers, shaping valleys, and testing the species that remained. The Homo sapiens who inherited this world carried within them memories not written in language but encoded in blood. The Neanderthal legacy strengthened them, gave them resistance against disease, and shaped their very appearance, the texture of hair, the tone of skin, the resilience of muscle. The fusion of two species had created something new, a humanity more varied, more durable, and more capable of enduring extremes. Across the plains of Europe and Asia, the last traces of Neanderthal presence lingered in artifacts and ashes. Tools of their making still glinted in the soil, carefully flaked stone edges that spoke of mastery, not simplicity. Caves once warmed by their fires now stood empty. Yet the marks they left on the walls and the bones within told of a life that was full, intelligent, and aware. They had loved, grieved, hunted, and imagined just as we did. Their extinction was not a failure of intellect, but a casualty of time and change. For Homo sapiens, this was the beginning of a new chapter, the age of memory. The world no longer belonged to many species of humans. It belonged to one. But within that unity came remembrance, a deep and growing awareness of the past, the bones unearthed, the tools discovered, the stories whispered in the dark. All of these became a kind of mirror through which early humans began to see themselves as part of something continuous. For the first time, the idea of ancestry took root. The inheritance of Neanderthal genes was not just physical, it was symbolic. It reminded the survivors that strength was born from connection, not division. Their bloodlines carried proof that humanity's power lay in its ability to blend, adapt, and evolve through relationship and exchange. The fusion that had once occurred quietly in the frozen shelters of the Ice Age now echoed in every generation that followed. As the climate began to warm and the great glaciers retreated, humans spread once more across the continents. They carried with them not just the fire of survival, but the spark of awareness. They began to bury their dead with care, to mark graves with stones and ochre, to tell stories of those who came before. The world was no longer simply inhabited, it was remembered. The last Neanderthal may have perished alone, but their memory became eternal through us. Every heartbeat, every breath, every spark of thought bears the shadow of their endurance. In our bones lives their history, and in our minds, their legacy continues. The age of memory had begun the moment when humanity not only survived, but began to understand itself as a story written by many hands across the deep silence of time. The world began to thaw. After tens of thousands of years locked in ice, the earth stirred beneath the sun once more. Rivers that had slept under frozen shells broke open and roared to life, carving new paths through the softening ground. Forests crept northward, reclaiming the barren plains where mammoths once roamed. For the first time in millennia, the air carried not only the bite of frost, but the scent of rain and soil. Humanity, the survivor of the cold age, began its long return home. From the caves of southern Europe to the steppes of Central Asia, small bands of people followed the retreating glaciers. Where ice had once ruled, new life flourished: grasses, herds, and fresh water. The world was changing, and humans, ever restless, changed with it. Their migrations no longer followed only the great beasts. Now they followed the promise of stability, of places where the land itself offered abundance. Valleys rich in game, coastlines heavy with shellfish, and river mouths brimming with fish became new havens for life. The warming climate brought both opportunity and memory. The generations that had endured the cold carried within them the knowledge of adaptation, the lessons learned from fire and scarcity. As they settled in gentler lands, those lessons became foundations for something entirely new. They began to linger longer in one place. Temporary shelters turned into lasting camps. Tools once meant for travel were replaced by those for cultivation and storage. The human relationship with the earth was beginning to shift from one of pursuit to one of partnership. In these fertile regions, the first experiments of settlement took shape. People gathered around lakes, building shelters from timber and reeds. They crafted fish traps, dug storage pits, and began to mark the seasons by the stars and the floods. The rhythm of migration gave way to the rhythm of the earth itself. The seeds of civilization were already stirring in the soil, though no one yet knew it. As the ice withdrew, the face of the planet transformed. Sea levels rose, swallowing ancient plains and connecting the world in new ways. Islands formed, rivers changed course, and coastlines took on familiar shapes. The people who once walked across dry land into distant continents now found their paths cut by the ocean. But where water divided, boats united. Early humans built rafts and canoes, tracing the edges of continents, exploring and adapting to the new, wetter world. The warmth did more than alter the land, it awakened memory. People began to look back at the frozen past not only with fear, but with reverence. The stories of survival became lessons, carried in myths and songs. They spoke of ancestors who had walked with mammoths, of great floods and endless winters, of fire that saved them when darkness ruled. These tales were not yet written, but they lived in the human voice, passing from one generation to the next. In the Great Melt, life became renewal. Humanity had endured extinction, adapted through change, and now stood at the threshold of possibility. The world they entered was fertile, unpredictable, and alive, a canvas waiting to be shaped. The long return home was not a journey back to where they began, but forward to what they were becoming. The earth was no longer an enemy to survive, but a partner to cultivate. And in that quiet transformation, the first roots of the human future began to take hold. The ice was retreating, but humanity was advancing. Across every horizon, Homo sapiens began to leave their mark on the recovering earth. From the frozen tundra to the steaming jungles, from ocean islands to mountain ridges, no environment proved too harsh, no climate too extreme. What had begun as a fragile experiment in survival had now become a triumph of adaptability. Humanity had learned not only to endure, but to thrive. This was the age when the human mind became the most powerful tool on the planet. The lessons of fire, stone, and endurance were now joined by something new: innovation. People who had once huddled in caves now built shelters suited to every landscape. In the Arctic, they crafted homes from snow and bone that trapped warmth like cocoons of light. In the tropics, they wove palm fronds into canopies that breathed with the wind. They were no longer shaped by their environment. They were shaping it. The oceans, once barriers, became highways. Humans built boats from hollowed logs and bundles of reeds, pushing out from shorelines into the unknown. They followed the stars, the currents, and the flight of birds, reaching new islands and coasts that no other species had ever touched. From the islands of Southeast Asia to the far edges of Australia, they carried with them not only tools and fire, but ideas. Wherever they went, they adapted. Wherever they adapted, they changed the land itself. Clothing became a second skin of invention. Needles made of bone, stitched together, hides and furs with precision, transforming survival gear into art. Beads, shells, and pigments turned necessity into identity. The way humans dressed began to tell stories of origin, of community, of belief. Even in the simplest adornments lay the first sparks of culture. But the greatest adaptation was not in tools or clothing. It was in the way humans began to think about one another. As groups grew larger and more interconnected, cooperation became civilization's earliest blueprint. Hunters coordinated across vast distances. Gatherers shared resources according to need and season. Words, gestures, and stories replaced isolation with belonging. In this growing web of relationships, a new strength emerged: social intelligence. The ability to trust, to organize, and to imagine together gave humanity an advantage no other creature could match. The earth responded to their expansion. Forests were cleared for camps, grasslands burned to attract new growth, rivers diverted to fill traps and pools. Every decision, every adaptation, left a mark. The planet was no longer a wilderness untouched by human hands. It was becoming a reflection of human imagination. By now, Homo sapiens had spread to every corner of the known world. They walked the high plateaus of Tibet, hunted seals along Arctic shores, and gathered fruit beneath equatorial suns. Their tools changed with the landscape, but the mind that guided them remained constant, restless, observant, endlessly creative. The same spark that once lit a fire in an African cave now illuminated every continent. This was the moment when humanity truly became planetary. No longer confined by climate or geography, they had mastered adaptation itself. They had turned survival into strategy and strategy into destiny. The species that once crouched in fear beneath the thunder now stood as the architects of their own future. The world belonged to those who could change, and in that art, no one surpassed the human. The unstoppable had begun. Fire had always been humanity's first ally, a miracle that turned fear into warmth and darkness into light. But as the Ice Age ended and the Earth softened beneath a warming sky, that ally began to change. What was once a small flicker of survival became a force that reshaped the planet itself. The gift of fire, which had lifted humanity above the beasts, now began to leave its mark upon the world. The first sparks of control had long symbolized triumph. Fire cooked food, hardened tools, and protected families from the cold. Yet with every new generation, its use spread beyond the hearth. Hunters learned that flames could drive herds into waiting traps. Gatherers discovered that burning the undergrowth brought new shoots and tender grazing for animals. These were acts of ingenuity, but also of transformation. The land, once wild and ancient in its rhythm, began to bend under the will of its newest master. From the plains of Africa to the woodlands of Europe, fires lit by human hands began to shape entire ecosystems. Trees gave way to grasslands, and species that had once lived in deep forests were pushed toward the edges of survival. The smoke that drifted into the air was more than the byproduct of flame, it was the first human fingerprint on the atmosphere. The earth had begun to feel the breath of its most ambitious inhabitant. At first, the changes seemed beneficial. Where fire passed, the soil grew rich, the animals returned, and life appeared abundant. But the balance was delicate. Repeated burning stripped the land of nutrients. Forests took centuries to recover, if they recovered at all. In places where humans lingered, the cycle of flame and regrowth began to shorten, until the world itself seemed to burn in rhythm with them. Humanity's oldest tool had become its first weapon against the natural order. The power of fire extended beyond survival, it began to shape imagination. Myths and rituals arose around it. Fire became sacred, a symbol of life and renewal, of destruction and rebirth. People carried embers from camp to camp as if carrying the heart of the earth itself. But as the flames spread wider, they also whispered of danger. Humanity's control was never perfect, and once unleashed, fire obeyed no one. Entire regions could vanish beneath its hunger. Archaeological layers from this era tell the story in ash. Charred soil and blackened sediments mark the arrival of humans across continents. Australia's megafauna, massive creatures that had roamed for millions of years, began to vanish soon after the first settlers arrived, perhaps hunted, perhaps burned out of their habitats. Similar patterns echo across the globe. Wherever humans went, the fire followed. For the first time in history, a single species had begun to alter the balance of the world's ecosystems. The sky, filled with the haze of distant smoke, the first trace of what would one day become the mark of civilization itself. Fire had granted humanity mastery over nature, but it also carried a price. In its light lay both progress and peril. As night fell across the young world, the glow of countless fires flickered on the horizon. It was a beautiful sight, warm, alive, defiant. Yet in that glow lay a truth that would echo through time. Humanity had found the power to shape the earth, but in doing so, had taken its first step toward shaping its own destiny for both creation and ruin. The age of mastery had begun, and with it, the hidden cost of fire. The first graves were not built for kings or warriors. They were shallow hollows in the earth, dug with hands that trembled between grief and reverence. Across continents, from the plains of Africa to the limestone caves of Europe and the steppes of Asia, the dead began to be laid to rest with care. Stones were placed over them, pigment sprinkled on their skin, and tools and ornaments buried by their sides. Something profound had shifted within the human mind. Death was no longer simply absence. It had become a passage, a mystery that called for meaning. For hundreds of thousands of years, death had been an ordinary fact of existence. Life ended, and the living moved on. But now, people began to linger. They gathered around the fallen, not out of instinct but from emotion and curiosity. The red ochre that stained the bones of the dead was more than decoration. It was ritual. It symbolized blood, life, renewal. In coloring the dead, humans were perhaps trying to give them back what time had taken away, a sign that even in loss, there was continuity. Graves became stories written in soil. In a cave at Kafse in Israel, a child was buried with deer antlers laid gently across its chest. In Sungir, Russia, 2 adolescents were interred head to head, their bodies adorned with thousands of ivory beads, fox teeth, and carved spears. Each burial was a language of symbols, an unspoken declaration that life continued in some unseen form. Through these acts, humanity crossed a threshold between survival and spirituality. This was the dawn of belief. The living began to imagine that the dead still journeyed somewhere, that the spirit could travel beyond the body. The flicker of a fire beside a grave was not only to keep predators away but to light the path for a soul returning to the unknown. The smell of burning herbs, the songs murmured over the dead, the objects chosen to accompany them, all spoke of a growing awareness that existence extended beyond what could be seen. With belief came comfort, but also awe. The human mind had awakened to forces it could not control: the cycles of birth and decay, the turning of the seasons, the silence that followed the last breath. To make sense of this, early humans gave shape to the invisible. They imagined ancestors watching from the stars, spirits in the wind, voices in the fire. Death had become the first teacher of faith. Every grave was both an end and a beginning. In honoring the dead, the living discovered themselves. The act of burial required foresight, cooperation, and emotion, qualities that bound communities together more deeply than the hunt or the harvest ever could. Mourning became memory, and memory became identity. The past began to live within the present. As the centuries passed, these rituals grew richer, evolving into ceremonies, songs, and myths. The idea of the afterlife took root in every culture, shaped by fear, love, and hope. What began as a handful of ochre and a whisper over a body became the foundation of religion, art, and philosophy. The spirit of the dead had awakened the spirit of the living. From that moment on, humanity would walk through life with one eye on the world and the other on eternity. The earth became not just a home but a sacred place, a bridge between the seen and the unseen, where every burial was a promise that nothing truly vanished, only changed. It began as sound, simple, raw, carried on the wind. A cry, a hum, a rhythm that rose from the throat of a creature learning to think beyond instinct. Over generations, those sounds took form. They became words. Words became meaning, and meaning became power. Language was the invisible invention that changed everything. It bound humans together in ways no tool, weapon, or fire ever could. It allowed thoughts to escape the prison of a single mind and live in the hearts of others. Across the plains of the Pleistocene world, where tribes moved with the rhythm of seasons and stars, the air itself became a vessel of memory. A warning shouted during a hunt could save lives. A name given to a newborn carried identity. A story told around the fire became a bridge between generations. In this new world of speech, knowledge could outlive the knower. For the first time, memory was no longer bound to the fragile body; it could travel on the wind. Language gave shape to culture. It allowed cooperation to grow beyond bloodlines, binding strangers with shared symbols and shared trust. Through language, people could organize hunts, build shelters, plan journeys, and mourn the dead. It created something unseen but unbreakable, a web of understanding that stretched across families, clans, and entire landscapes. Every word carried history. Every story carried belonging. The earliest storytellers became the keepers of identity. Around the glow of firelight, they spoke of the hunt, of ancestors, of the creation of the world. They sang of storms and spirits, of love and loss, of lessons learned through hardship. In their voices lived both knowledge and wonder. What began as practical communication evolved into poetry, myth, and wisdom. These stories became the heartbeat of human continuity. Through them, the past was never lost. Over time, language shaped thought itself. The ability to name things brought control over them. To describe a mountain was to make it real in the mind. To name an emotion was to understand it. Words became a mirror of consciousness, reflecting the growing complexity of human thought. They allowed abstract ideas to exist: time, justice, beauty, the divine. The world was no longer just seen. It was interpreted, discussed, remembered. As humans spread across continents, languages diverged and multiplied like living organisms. Each tribe developed its own patterns of sound, its own rhythm of meaning, its own way of shaping the universe. Thousands of tongues blossomed, each carrying the DNA of its people's history. Yet beneath the variety, all languages shared a common purpose: to connect minds, to preserve memory, to make the invisible visible. Through speech, humanity built something that no other creature had achieved: a collective consciousness. Words could unite or divide, heal or wound, but they always carried the same spark: the desire to be understood. Culture became inheritance, passed not through blood, but through stories. The invisible glue of shared memory turned small groups into tribes, tribes into cultures, and cultures into civilizations. And even now, thousands of years later, when the ancient words have shifted and the old tongues have fallen silent, the essence remains. Every sentence we speak is a continuation of that first whisper carried by the wind. Language is our oldest companion, the echo of humanity's first attempt to defy silence. In every story told and every word remembered, we still hear those early voices singing, teaching, and reminding us that to speak is to be human, and to be heard is to live forever. The great silence of the Ice Age was ending. Across the planet, the grip of the glaciers loosened, and the earth began to move again. For thousands of years, the world had known only cold, its mountains crowned in white and its valleys carved by endless ice. Now, the air softened, the sun lingered longer, and the frozen giants began to retreat. Rivers swelled with meltwater, carving new paths through the land. The planet that humanity had endured was vanishing, and a new one was being born in its place. The change came slowly, but its consequences were immense. Oceans rose as the ice melted, drowning the plains where mammoths once roamed. Coastlines shifted with every century, swallowing forests and revealing islands where none had existed before. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath the rising sea, erasing the footprints of generations. For those who lived through it, the world must have felt alive, breathing, flooding, breaking apart. Across what is now Southeast Asia, a vast continent known as Sundaland sank beneath the waves, leaving behind only the scattered islands of Indonesia and the Philippines. To the north, the English Channel opened, cutting Britain from the European mainland. The Black Sea filled with salt water, transforming from a lake into an ocean inlet. Everywhere, ancient land bridges vanished, separating families, tribes, and species forever. The world that humans had walked freely was fragmenting. But while the land changed, humanity adapted once again. The people who had once followed herds across open plains now turned to the waters for sustenance. Fishing, once a skill of necessity, became an art of survival. Coastal communities flourished, crafting boats from logs and reeds, learning to follow tides and currents. The sea, once a boundary, became a highway of connection. The floods and tremors of this warming world did more than reshape geography. They reshaped the human imagination. Stories began to emerge, passed down through generations, of great deluges that swallowed the land. From Mesopotamia to the Pacific Islands, tales of floods and lost worlds echo the same ancient memory, the age when the waters rose and the old earth was gone. These myths were not fantasy but remembrance, preserved in the rhythm of oral tradition. Humanity, even as it adapted, did not forget. As the planet warmed, new opportunities arose. Forests spread across once frozen ground, rivers nourished fertile plains, and wildlife returned in abundance. People followed these transformations, moving into valleys rich with soil and game. The stability of climate allowed them to stay longer in one place, to build, to plan, to dream. The seeds of settlement began to take root in the mud left behind by retreating floods. The earth itself seemed to breathe anew, but the balance was delicate. For the first time, humanity's survival was not threatened by the cold, but by change. To thrive in this new world, people had to understand it, anticipate it, and shape it. The same adaptability that had carried them through the Ice Age now guided them into a future of abundance and of uncertainty. As the last glaciers melted into memory, humanity stood on the threshold of transformation. The great migrations of the past gave way to the first whispers of permanence. The world that had once tested humanity now offered it the means to rise beyond mere survival. But the cost of this stability would soon reveal itself. The earth had shifted, and with it, the fate of humankind. The world was awakening, but not everyone was ready to settle. As the earth warmed and the first seeds of farming took root in fertile valleys, some humans turned away from the promise of stability. They chose instead to follow the wind, the stars, and the migrations of the herds. They became the last nomads, the guardians of an ancient rhythm that had carried humanity across continents for more than 200,000 years. Their lives were bound to the pulse of nature. They knew the path of the reindeer and the seasons of the salmon. They could read the flight of birds as clearly as maps and sense the coming of rain in the whisper of leaves. Theirs was a knowledge not written in symbols or stored in clay, but carried in memory and passed through story. It was the memory of movement itself, of being part of the landscape rather than master of it. Across the plains of Africa, in the tundras of the north, and through the deserts of Arabia, these wanderers walked in the footprints of their ancestors. They left little behind except the faint traces of their camps and the stories that drifted with the smoke of their fires. They were living archives of a world that was disappearing, a world where freedom was measured not by ownership, but by the horizon. For thousands of generations, movement had been the essence of human existence. The body was shaped for travel, the mind for adaptation. To stop was to risk starvation or defeat. But as the glaciers melted and the planet grew more forgiving, a new kind of life began to spread. In river valleys and coastal plains, people stayed in one place long enough to watch seeds grow, to build homes from mud and wood, to measure the passing of time, not by migration, but by harvest. The age of wandering was ending, and the age of settlement was beginning. The nomads who remained became witnesses to this transformation. They saw forests cleared for planting, herds penned instead of followed, rivers dammed and divided. The open world they once roamed freely was slowly shrinking. Yet even as the settled life took hold, something in the hearts of these wanderers resisted. They carried with them the wisdom of movement, an understanding of the earth as a living thing that could not truly be possessed. To them, the land was not property but kin. They were not relics of the past, but reminders of balance. Their survival depended on harmony with the cycles of the wild, a relationship that civilization would one day forget. They lived lightly, taking only what they needed, leaving room for the earth to breathe. Their fires flickered under open skies. their footsteps tracing invisible lines across mountains and dunes, as they kept alive a way of life older than memory itself. As millennia passed, the last nomads would dwindle in number, pushed to the margins of the world by the expansion of fields and cities. But their spirit endured in the explorer who followed the horizon, in the sailor who crossed unknown seas, in the dreamer who looked to the stars. The desire to move, to seek, to wander without boundaries remained in the human soul. The last nomads were not merely people of the past, they were the echo of humanity's first freedom, the unbroken thread connecting us to the beginning. Though their paths faded beneath grass and time, the wind still carries their song, a reminder that before we built walls and plowed soil, we belonged to the open world, and the world belonged to us. It began quietly, in the soft soil of river valleys shaped by time and flood. The Ice Age had ended, and with the retreat of the glaciers came a gentler world. In the fertile crescent of the Near East, between the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Jordan, humans discovered a different kind of rhythm, one not measured by stars or migrations, but by the slow turning of the seasons. Here, among the grasses of wild barley and wheat, they began to plant. What began as a simple act of curiosity became the foundation of everything that would follow. At first, it was an experiment born of necessity. The herds they once followed had moved on, and the wild abundance of the old world was fading. But the land beneath their feet promised something new. When seeds scattered near their camps began to sprout, humans noticed. They learned to return, to care for those patches of green, to harvest and replant. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the idea of home took root. The great transformation was not marked by invention, but by patience. The same hands that once carved stone tools now pressed seeds into damp earth. Fire, once used to shape weapons, was now used to clear land for fields. Water, once followed across the land, was now guided by channels and ditches to nourish crops. The relationship between humans and nature changed forever. The wild world that had sustained them was no longer something to follow, it was something to manage, to control. Villages began to rise near fertile plains and riversides. Huts of reed and clay grew into clusters of homes. People who once roamed thousands of miles now spent their lives within sight of their own fields. Domesticated animals grazed nearby: sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, all reshaped by human will. For the first time, survival did not depend on the chase, but on the harvest. The world felt safer, more predictable. But beneath that security lay the beginning of dependence. The first fields gave birth to surplus, and surplus gave birth to change. Food could now be stored, counted, and guarded. This created new roles, new hierarchies, and new forms of power. Those who controlled the grain controlled the people. The old equality of the hunt was gone, replaced by the slow division between those who labored and those who owned. The roots of civilization were not only agricultural, they were social. Archaeological sites, like Jericho, Chayonu, and Abu Huraira, still whisper of this transformation. Layers of ash, seeds, and pottery record the shift from wandering to permanence. Within those layers lies the story of humanity's first true revolution, the Neolithic transition. It was not a discovery made overnight, but a gradual surrender to a new way of life. Each planted seed was a promise and a chain, binding humanity to the land as firmly as the roots of the crops themselves. As the years turned into generations, the fields expanded, and so did the human imagination. From the first small gardens grew societies, and from societies, empires. The same rivers that nourished crops would one day nourish kingdoms. Yet in this moment of triumph, few could have foreseen the cost. By taming the earth, humans had unknowingly set the stage for their greatest paradox: comfort at the expense of freedom, abundance shadowed by inequality. the first seeds of the new age had been sown. Beneath their quiet growth lay the echoes of the past, the same hunger for control, the same faith in progress, and the same blindness to what was being lost. The cycle had begun again, repeating the first mistake in the name of survival. The wild had given way to the cultivated, and in doing so, humanity stepped across an invisible threshold from harmony to dominion, from wanderer to settler, from child of the earth to its architect. Long after their bones had turned to dust, the memory of the Neanderthals lingered. The people who came after them, the farmers, the wanderers, the builders of the first villages, walked through landscapes still bearing their traces. In caves where ancient fires once burned, in valleys shaped by their hands, the echoes of the vanished kind endured. Humanity had inherited the world, but not the silence. The memory of those who came before whispered through the generations, transformed into legend. Across early human cultures, stories began to surface of towering beings who once ruled the mountains and forests. They were called giants, ancestors of extraordinary strength, spirits who had shaped the land itself. These were not inventions born of imagination alone. They were memories, distorted by time, of real beings who had once shared the earth with us. The Neanderthals had lived side by side with Homo sapiens for thousands of years. They had interbred, exchanged tools, and perhaps even shared language. When they vanished, their absence was too profound to forget. In the shadows of Europe's limestone caves and the river valleys of the Near East, early farmers found relics they did not understand: massive bones, thick skulls, tools unlike their own. They could not know these belonged to their ancient cousins, so they crafted stories to explain them. The bones became the remains of fallen gods, the tools the weapons of titans. The earth itself, they believed, had once been shaped by hands far larger than theirs. From these interpretations grew some of humanity's earliest myths. In the Near East, tales emerged of primordial beings who molded clay into life. In Greece, legends told of the Cyclopes and Titans, beings of immense power cast down by the new order of gods. In the mountains of Europe and Asia, stories spoke of ancient races turned to stone, their spirits trapped in cliffs and boulders. These myths, though separated by thousands of miles, shared one truth: humanity could still feel the shadow of another kind of human, one older, stronger, and closer to the earth. The legacy of the Neanderthals was not only buried in myth but written into our very being. Their genes live within us still, influencing our biology, shaping our resilience, even guiding the way our bodies adapt to cold and altitude. Yet our ancestors did not understand DNA. What they understood was reverence. They built monuments of stone to honor those who came before, stacking great slabs in circles and rows, as if to speak to the past in the language of permanence. Perhaps they sensed, in some deep way, that they were not the first to dream, to create, to wonder. The Neanderthals had once made art, cared for their dead, and survived the most brutal ages of the world. They were not beasts but mirrors, showing us what it meant to be human, long before we named it. As the centuries passed, and the myths grew richer, the echoes of these ancient beings became part of the human identity. They were no longer just the vanished. They were the sacred memory of endurance. To remember them was to remember where we came from. Even now, when we gaze upon the mountains at dusk or stand in the cool breath of a cave, we feel a faint connection to them. Their story lives not only in our genes, but in our imagination. The giants of legend were never just myths, they were the memory of kin, the first reflection of ourselves cast against the deep wall of time. Humanity had inherited their fire, their strength, and their silence. And in that silence, the echo of giants still endures. From the moment the first spark leapt from stone to tinder, fire became more than survival, it became a story. Across continents and generations, from the open plains of Africa to the shadowed caves of Europe, that light burned on. It glowed in the eyes of wanderers and in the hearths of families who no longer feared the dark. Fire was humanity's constant companion, its mirror and its muse. Every flame told the same tale, of endurance, curiosity, and the will to understand. The Ice Age had passed, the giants were gone, and the last nomads were giving way to farmers and builders. But through every change, the fire remained. It illuminated the hands that shaped tools, the eyes that read the stars, and the hearts that searched for meaning beyond the visible world. No invention, no symbol, no structure was as universal as that flickering glow. It united all who had come before and all who would come after. To those early humans, fire was not simply a tool, it was life itself. It gave warmth to newborns, safety to the weak, and food to the hungry. It turned night into day and transformed chaos into control. Yet, it was also unpredictable, a force to be feared as much as revered. In its beauty lay danger, in its light, the shadow of destruction. Perhaps that is why it fascinated us so deeply. Fire was the first teacher of duality, showing that creation and ruin were born from the same flame. As humanity spread across the globe, fire carried its legacy. It marked the roots of migration, each hearth a declaration that humans had arrived and claimed their place. In the caves of France, its light revealed paintings that captured the heartbeat of the hunt. In the valleys of Mesopotamia, it baked the clay that would hold the first records of civilization. In the mountains of Asia, it tempered metal, giving rise to tools, weapons, and artistry. Fire became the thread that stitched together the fabric of human progress. But beyond its practical power, it ignited something deeper within the human soul. Around its glow, people spoke their first stories, shared their first dreams, and asked their first questions. Why do we live? What lies beyond the horizon? What happens when the fire inside us goes out? The flames reflected not only faces but taught the awareness that life was fragile, fleeting, and precious. Fire was the visible soul of humanity, always consuming, always transforming, always reaching upward. Even as centuries turned to millennia, the meaning of fire evolved. It became the forge of empires, the heart of temples, the beacon of discovery. Every leap in knowledge, from the spark of flint to the spark of electricity, was a continuation of the same quest. The fire that once burned in caves now burned in cities, in engines, in the hearts of those who sought to explore the stars. Through disaster and rebirth, the flame endured. Civilizations rose and fell. Forests burned and regrew. Yet humanity's fire never truly went out. It survived in our inventions, in our art, in our relentless search for understanding. It was more than a chemical reaction, it was a symbol of our spirit, our refusal to surrender to the cold indifference of the universe. Today, that same ancient light still burns. It burns in the circuits of our machines, in the glow of our cities, in the imagination that drives us to create and to question. What began as warmth against the dark has become the eternal spark of consciousness itself. The fire that remains is no longer bound to wood or stone, it lives within us. The last and greatest inheritance of all who came before. Humanity had survived extinction, but more than that, it had learned to make meaning of survival. The flame that once flickered in the caves now blazes across the world, a reminder that as long as we remember how to keep the fire alive, the human story will never end. Night falls once more over the ancient world. The wind drifts through forgotten valleys, across plains where herds once thundered, and over the caves that sheltered the first whispers of humanity. The fires that once glowed against the Ice Age dark are long extinguished, but their light has never truly died. It burns still in every city, every discovery, every thought that dares to ask why. We return now to the beginning, to the breath of the first fire and the footprints pressed into volcanic ash. The first humans are gone, yet their dream endures. In the silence of deep time, the story of our species unfolds not as a line but as a circle. From the hunters who walked beneath the frozen stars to the farmers who sowed the first fields, from the artists who painted their awe upon stone to the thinkers who learned to count the passing of the moon, every generation carried the same ember forward. They did not know what they were building, yet their every act, every tool chipped, every word spoken, every child taught, was a step in the long awakening of the human mind. We call them ancestors, but they were dreamers. They dreamed of warmth in the cold, of meaning in death, of pattern in the stars. They dreamed of continuity, of memory, of the possibility that what was once wild could be understood. Those dreams became stories, and the stories became civilization. Even now, when we look into the night sky and wonder if we are alone, we are echoing their first questions whispered beside the fire. The earth that bore them has changed beyond recognition. The glaciers have melted, the forests have moved, and the bones of those early people rest beneath layers of soil and history. Yet their presence remains in ways we can still feel. It hums in our blood, written in the double helix of inheritance. It lingers in our instincts, the way we seek warmth, the way we gather, the way we build. Every gesture we make carries the weight of a lineage that began long before memory. Their rise and fall were not separate moments, but chapters of one unbroken story. They fell to famine, to ice, to time, but their knowledge was never lost. It lived on through us, shaped by adaptation, transformed by survival. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the early Homo sapiens all vanished in body, but not in essence. Together, they wrote the preface to what humanity would become. The dream that began in the savannas of Africa did not end in the caves of Europe or the plains of Asia. It crossed oceans, survived cataclysm, and endured every trial the earth could offer. It is the dream that taught us to imagine, to question, to create. It is the reason we paint our walls, build our monuments, and look beyond our world for meaning. Now, as we stand at the edge of our own future, surrounded by light and noise of our making, we are still chasing the same mystery that stirred in the hearts of those who first saw the fire dance. What does it mean to be human? The answer has never changed. It lives in our ability to dream, to see beyond hunger and fear, to reach for something larger than ourselves. The stars above us tonight are the same ones our ancestors watched as they wondered who they were. Their voices are gone, their faces erased by time, but their story endures in us. The rise and fall of the first human was never an ending, it was the beginning of everything. And as long as we remember the light that guided them through darkness, their dream will continue, carried by the fire that still burns within us all.